And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, and that's actually the first place I want to stop and open up the opportunity for discussion a little bit. Paul was waiting for them. Who was Paul waiting for? Silas and Timothy. That was the main part of his traveling party, and those were his co-workers in this endeavor. What do we tend to do, people in general, what do we tend to do when we set out plans to do a particular task, especially if we work with other people and we plan these things together, to work together? What do we tend to do if our co-workers are not present? We tend to wait. That's exactly what we tend to do. Sometimes we have big plans, and we're going to do these things, and we're going to have a group together to do it, and we get there, and there's one or maybe two of us that arrive, and we're discouraged and convinced that it's a job too big for a single person, and so we just give up. And I'm going to give a real live example of something that's happened right here in our fair city involving this congregation in the time that I've been here working. And I don't remember how long ago it was, and I don't remember what year it was. I don't remember who was preaching the gospel meeting, but we had a gospel meeting scheduled. It was coming up. We had talked about it for weeks in advance, and it was determined by one of the elders that it would be a great thing for us to get together on the Saturday preceding the meeting. So we're talking about not the day before the meeting, but the week before that. And to work the neighborhoods here around the church building. And so announcements were made that we were going to gather up here that morning and what time we were going to gather, and we printed up extra flyers, and we had a plan. And we were going to go cover the neighborhoods in the immediate area surrounding the building here and try to get as many people to come to the meeting as we possibly could get. And me and him were the only two people that showed up. Did we go into the neighborhoods around the building and hand out flyers that day? We didn't, actually. We determined that it would be more effective for each of us to go our own way and to reach as many people as we could as individuals. But that particular program of work that we had planned for was set aside because we didn't have the personnel that we had intended to have to execute our plan the way that we intended to. And that's what generally tends to happen when things like that go down. If you are planning a preaching trip like Paul was on, and he had two faithful co-workers with him that he relied upon to do part of the teaching and to help him in his service, he finds himself in a very large city, very far away from home, where he knew no one, and he was all alone, running from a riot that had just assembled in the previous city, literally wanting to kill him. It would have been very easy for Paul to do what? Say, I can't do anything in this big old city by myself. I don't know anybody. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to sit here and wait. And notice that's where it starts. He was waiting. He said, we saw that verse 15, he gave the people that carried him to Athens a command to tell Silas and Timothy to get there as soon as possible. And so there's an urgency in his mind for them to be with him, and so he's now sitting in Athens by himself where he knows no one, a large city populated with a lot of people. And it says his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he's looking around and he realizes that this is a seat of idolatry as well. Now, if you see idol worship all around you, what do you assume? Okay? You do assume that there's a lot of pagans. And if you're preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, what do you assume? There's not an audience. Look what he does. He sees a city full of idols. It provokes his spirit. So instead of continuing to wait for his companions, he is immediately moved to action. Instead of doing what many of us would do, which is say, the job is too big and there's too many things in between me and success and I can't do this by myself, I need my help. I'm going to wait here until they get here, however long that takes. He's provoked by what he sees and driven to act alone. And so he goes to the synagogue that was there. How big it was, how many Jews were in that town, I have no idea, but he goes to the synagogue. And we saw, by the way, when he got to Berea, that that's the first thing that he did, and it says that that was his what? That was his custom. So what we find out was by starting in the synagogue, all he was doing is he just determined that there was too much to be done in Athens, that he couldn't wait for them. And he began working the plan alone. And there's an important lesson in that for us, I believe. I think for far too many of us, we sit around and we say, well, the church doesn't do enough in our community. We're not reaching out. We're not reaching enough people. We're not having an effect. We don't plan anything. We're not working together. So-and-so's not doing this. So-and-so's not doing that. That person, that I can't do it by myself, so I'm just not going to do anything. And the fact of the matter is, if I see a city that is without God, and I know the truth, even if I'm all alone, I should be provoked to go do what I can do. That's where Paul's faith brought him, at least. As he was provoked in his spirit by what he saw, and so, because of that, it says he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. Okay, who are these devout persons that he found in the synagogues to reason with? Well, there's two groups talked about here. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. Yeah, I think, and that's all I can say about this, but I think that these were probably Greek proselytes who went to the Jewish synagogue to study the Jewish scriptures. And so the distinguishing factor between the Jews and the devout persons is that these were, obviously they were devout Jews if they were in the synagogue. And then other devout persons would have been Greek proselytes who had begun to study and pursue the Hebrew God. That's at least what I believe that that's talking about there. But he didn't stop with that, did he? That's not the end of the sentence. There's a comma after devout persons. And it says, and in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. And so he goes to the synagogue, which is his custom, and he begins to work with the religious people, with the people who are already studying the prophets, who are already reading the Psalms, who are already familiar with the work of God through the Hebrews. But he doesn't stop with them. He doesn't just go to the friendly place and discuss the scriptures with people that he has something in common with. He also goes out to the marketplace. Now, what's the marketplace? It's exactly what it sounds like. It is the place where people conducted business. In the late 1970s and 1980s, in an American city, where would Paul have gone? To the mall. Today, well, actually this year, he'd have had to go online, I guess. I don't know, there's nobody anywhere. But up until this year, I used to say that the current place would probably be like Walmart, where people go to conduct daily business, and where you're going to find as many people as possible. And whoever he found there, he talked to and reasoned with about God. Now, we know that the rank and file people in the city of Athens were what? They were idolaters. They worshipped some Greek god represented by some idol. But he didn't let that stop him, and he didn't say, oh, they're not interested in talking about what I have to talk about. He goes to where the people are, and he talks to whoever, and that's the language there is really interesting. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. And so these were not people that he knew. These were not people who he had anything in common with. These are just people that he randomly interacted with in the place of commerce in the city of Athens. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, the next verse says. So he's talking clearly to Greeks as well as to the Jews, and to the rank and file Greeks, and to the philosophers, the teachers of these Greek philosophies. And there's two of them particularly that are named, the Epicurean and the Stoic. Does anybody know anything about those two philosophical schools? That's exactly what the Epicureans were. They were fond of luxury. They were fond of sensuality. The Epicurean philosophy or philosophical system is much more complex than this, but over the course of history, it has been boiled down to one catchphrase, which is eat, drink, and be merry. And they did believe actually in a type of temperance when it came to this kind of stuff, but the idea was you need to enjoy what life has to give as much as you need to in order to have a good time. Whatever makes you feel good, pursue it. Don't overdo it, but do as much as it takes in order for you to enjoy life and for you to get your worries off your mind. And so we boiled it down to eat, drink, and be merry. So there's the philosophers, the people who are out there teaching the people that the way to a fulfilled and satisfied life is to just embrace sensuality and embrace and imbibe in food and drink and satisfy your body until you find happiness. So that's one group. And then the Stoics. Do we know anything about the Stoics? For the benefit of those that are watching online, the suggestion is rather straight-lined and boring. And that's probably not a bad... The best thing I can relate to, think Spock from Star Trek. The Stoics were all about logic. They were about self-control. They were about overcoming their emotions and keeping all of that in check. And they believed that reason and logic was the way to a fulfilled and happy life. And you got to keep the rest of this stuff under control. So basically, the Epicureans and the Stoics are set forth here as kind of, to me at least, bookends. The people that embrace and satisfy the flesh and the people that are trying to control that aspect of humanity as much as possible, all seeking to attain the same thing. Both of these represent human philosophies about happiness. And I think as well that there are many other schools that existed in Athens and that were argued for in Athens by various philosophers. And there's a lot of very famous philosophers that we've studied in school, and they all came out of, not from this time period, but they all came out of this area. And so these schools of thought would have been still prevalent in those days. And so there's all these schools of thought. And Athens was kind of a seat of learning among the Greeks. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And so we have all of these competing philosophies that are all designed to achieve the same thing, which is what? Fulfillment in life. What's the purpose of life? And how do we fulfill that purpose? And all of these human philosophies were designed to get people from where they were to fulfillment of their purpose in life. And so we've got those that are fond of luxury and that are fond of sensuality, and then we have those that are controlling emotions and as was suggested, boring. When I think of, I mentioned Spock, in real terms, what I think, anybody ever watch football in the 70s and 80s? Dallas Cowboys? Coach Tom Landry, who it didn't matter if they were up by 50 points or they were down by 50 points, he looked exactly the same on the sideline. The very worst thing could happen in the world, the players could make the worst mistake, and he never raised his voice and he never yelled at anyone, and he's the epitome of stoicism, at least publicly, as he was presented. There was you could never tell how he felt about something based upon his speech or conduct. And so that's what the Stoics were trying to do, is to control that aspect of the human nature they believed was the key to finding happiness. And so he finds all of that as he's in these common places, and he finds these philosophers who are arguing for these schools of thought, and he's conversing with them. And some, it said, what does this babbler wish to say? Now, what's a babbler? Okay, somebody keeps talking but saying nothing. And by the way, where does that word come from? Anybody know? Yeah, way back in Genesis in the Tower of Babel. And so you'll remember what happened at the Tower of Babel is God confused their languages. They couldn't communicate with each other anymore. What one another said didn't make sense at that point. When you're talking about someone babbling, it means they're talking, but there's nothing being said that you can understand or make sense out of. And so they kind of viewed Paul as being that, just someone who was talking, but they didn't really understand what he was saying. And some, it said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities. And so there were some that understood that he was talking about religion and God, but they didn't really understand it because it says he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And so this reaction and the confusion that existed among the Greeks rested in the fact that he was talking about Jesus and he was talking about the resurrection. These were things that they had not heard about before, number one. And number two, the concept of the resurrection seems rather foolish, does it not? And so the whole thing, they find it odd. And they find what he has to say as odd. And so it says they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. And so we want to talk about the Areopagus for a moment. The Hill of Ares is what that is. This is outside of the main city of Athens. It is an elevated area. There's actually an elevated hill there. And it was a place that the Greek court was held in Athens. And you got to keep in mind that Greece was an honest-to-goodness democracy. And so all males over a certain age had a voice in government. We get our term church from the Greek term ekklesia, which means called out, and that's what they did. When there was a major decision that needed to be made in the city, they would call everyone out, and the men would all assemble, and they would talk it out and come to a conclusion and make a decision. Well, what happened at this Greek council was the leading men held council, and this is where questions of right and wrong and what to do and all that kind of stuff were heard, and decisions were made about things like murder. If someone was accused of murder, this is where they would have put on the trial and made the arguments and made determinations about what should be done about these people, whether the person was guilty and how they needed to be punished. It is where they answered debates about religion and all sorts of things along morals and religion and that kind of stuff. That's what happens in this place. The council itself became known as the Areopagus. And so when it says that they brought him there, that's what they did. They took Paul from where he was at in Athens, and they brought him out here to where all of the wise men of Athens were gathered together and were answering these big questions. And they bring him out there and say, let's hear what you have to say. Make your case. So that a decision can be made about how to receive Paul. You bring some strange things to our ears. This whole concept of one God who made the world and all things in it. This whole concept of His Son who came in the flesh and died and was raised on the third day and ascended back into heaven. Strange to them. And so you bring some strange thing to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Make it plain to us. Explain to us exactly what you're saying, what you're suggesting, and what you think it means. And then there's a explanatory verse in verse 21 that says, "Now all the Athenians." Now again, when you read a universal statement like that about a city, that doesn't mean that every single individual. That means that, generally speaking, the attitude of Athenians, people that lived in the city of Athens, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there, and so this was a prevailing attitude of the people who resided in Athens, would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. And again, that's a bit of an overstatement to make a point as well. That doesn't mean that they literally did nothing else, but it means that they had an unnatural interest in new and novel things that they had never heard before. And so that's why they bring Paul up here, is so Paul can be put on, philosophical trial, and they can listen to what he has to say and determine whether it's something worth inquiring into or whether it's just foolishness and he ought to be rejected. And they have this morbid curiosity about new things they hadn't heard about. Oh, let me hear more. And so that's what's going on. And that's how he gets to this place where this sermon is going to be preached. Now, I want you to put yourself in Paul's shoes for a moment. Think about you being alone, not having your friends with you. You're in a strange city, surrounded by a lot of people that you know have a different background than you and have a different religion than you. And you begin preaching the gospel to them, and you get into a discussion with some of the more learned people in town, and they drag you out to the place where they air out and have all of these big debates about these major things, and put you front and center stage and say, okay, convince us. What would you do? Okay, That's a good plan. But what's the number one fear of most people in the world? Anybody know? It actually consistently comes in above death. I think it's connected. Micah, I'm going to put you on the spot. You offering the invitation tonight? I wasn't planning on it. See, we found out that the person who was supposed to do the invitation is not going to be here tonight, and so he came to let me know that a little bit earlier today, and I said, well, you want to do it? And he said, not really. Why not? He said lack of experience. Here's the truth. People hate public speaking. They hate to be in the center of the room with everybody listening to them. They hate to be put on the spot. They're afraid that they're going to make a mistake. They're afraid that they're going to look foolish. They're afraid that they're going to be all alone. They're afraid that they're going to fail. Paul was a human. He had all those same worries and concerns that all humans have. This is the kind of place where people clam up and quit talking. This is where stage fright comes in. This is where camera fright comes in. There's a lot of people who are real good about talking about things and that think, oh, I could do that, talk about acting or talk about being on TV, but then when the camera's actually there and it's rolling and they realize that 1 million people are watching them, all of a sudden they can't act at all. They're frozen like a deer in the headlights because of the circumstances and the fact that all eyes are on them. Here Paul is all by himself in the seat of Greek knowledge, learning, and wisdom, surrounded by the brightest minds and the most influential people in the city of Athens. The closest thing that I could possibly imagine in the United States that would parallel this would be if you were drugged to Washington, D.C. and had to testify before Congress. Live, in person, in front of all the cameras, and with everybody watching, and every word being parsed and analyzed and critiqued, and people listening to you, looking for the mistakes, ready to question and probe, and that's the scenario that Paul's in. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Now, I want to make something abundantly clear. I believe that this sermon ultimately comes from God. That this is Paul functioning as a prophet or as an apostle. And that he was not coming up with these things on his own. But this is quite impressive what he does. Now, you'll recall, we just read a few moments ago, that when he saw all the idolatry in the city, he was moved by that and pressed into immediate service where he couldn't continue to wait any longer because of what he saw. And so he uses that to his advantage as he's given this speech. He says, look, I noticed that you're religious. I saw all of the signs of religion around here, all of the objects of your worship. And then he says this, among them I noticed that there was one that said to an unknown God. And apparently, among Athens, there was all kinds of schools of thought in Athens, and there was all kinds of deities that were worshipped in Athens. And there were people who recognized that maybe there was something that they didn't know. Maybe there was a God that they didn't know about. And so we need to erect an idol for this God that we don't even know. And so Paul sees this, and he uses this to introduce this topic. Now, we want to back up a bit and pick up some things that we've talked about already, but we don't want to forget about. They hear him talking, some of the philosophers do, and they begin to ask questions, and they say, what does this babbler wish to say? And they say, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities. And so they're trying to make sense out of what Paul's talking about, and they understand that what he's saying to them is foreign to them. And so, by doing what he does here, he explains why they haven't heard about this God. He's this unknown God that they already have admitted may exist. And this strange deity that I'm talking to you about, this is the one that you've already noticed, and you worship as unknown. Now, when he says that, you worship as unknown, how do you worship an unknown God? If you don't know anything about the God, you don't know what they desire, you don't know what they want, you have no knowledge about the God at all, you just say, well, there might be a God. How do you worship that God? The answer is, you have nothing to go on, so you have to do what? Just make it up. Do the best you can to make it up. He says, what you're doing in ignorance, let me tell you how to actually worship that God. Let me actually inform you about that God that you acknowledge is there, but is unknown to you. I know about that God. And so he does a great job of relating to his audience there and giving them a reason to hear him. I'm going to tell you something that you already realize you don't know. Now keep in mind, again, we were told that the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing more than telling or hearing something new. So this plays right into their interest. Wait a minute. He's going to tell us about the God that we don't know. He's going to give us information that's completely new to us, things that we've known. So, what do you have to say? He said, the God who made the world and everything in it. Now, this is a very bold statement. We don't have to know everything about Greek religion. But almost everybody in the room has, well, I think every single person in the room, because I don't think the babies are in here, are they? All right, so every single person in this room has been at least through high school. Many of us have been through college. We have at some point studied what is called Greek mythology, and we know about the gods and the demigods to some extent. We have a memory about that. Essentially, what do we know about Greek and Roman gods and their systems of worship? And the answer to that is they basically came up with a God to explain almost everything. Any phenomenon in nature, they had a God to explain it. And so, what does it mean when Paul says, hey, this God that you worship in ignorance, that you don't know about, I'm going to tell you about, He's the God who made the world and everything in it. Well, it immediately says to them, whoever you are, whatever you believe, and whatever you think you know, this God matters to you, because whatever you know had to have come from Him. He made the world and everything in it. Being Lord of heaven and earth. See, He's not just the Lord in heaven. He's not just the Lord where He is. He's the Lord of the earth as well. He does not live in temples made by man. Now, there were temples all over the place to their gods. And the Hebrew God had a temple as well back in Jerusalem. And that's the way people thought about it. That was the God of Jerusalem, and then you had a God over here, and you had a God over here. And you'll remember the story of Jonah. And when Jonah was sent to preach, he tried to run to Tarshish because he was trying to get away from God. The idea of this limit of the influence of a god is present there. I think it's Corinth that Diana was the preeminent god. In Athens, there was a different preeminent god. And in this other city, they were tied to some other of the Greek god that was doing. And that was the more influential one in all these different places in their mindset. He says, look, the God I'm talking to you about, the God that you don't know about, He made the world and everything in it, and He is the God of both heaven and earth. There's no limits to where His rule is. There's no limits to where His power goes. He does not live in temples. He's not limited to a building that we construct, and He doesn't have to stay there. Nor is He served by human hands, as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And so, yes, ma'am.
It was an interactive move for each of these nations and cities to worship the rulers of those governments. And the ruler would be out there worshiping the God because they needed all of the attention.
Right.
When I was talking to some Iranians years ago, it got back and forth, and I said, look, Muhammad went up to the mountain and he couldn't think of anything else. He plagiarized parts of the Bible, came down so that they could control their nation and the women and everybody else in the nation. I said, that's all this is about.
And there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. And so what Paul is well, I'm going to rephrase that. What God is doing here in this message is laying the foundation for why He is preeminent and why every single person needs to know and understand Him and needs to know and understand how to relate to Him. God, the God who made the world and everything in it, doesn't rely upon humans to make Him. All of the Greek gods were envisioned and developed by humans to explain things that they saw. Their forms were shaped by the imagination of man. Their temples were built by men, and their worship was designed by man to accomplish whatever they ascribed to that God. And what he's saying here is that's not the way it really works. That's not the way it works when you have a real God. Because God made man, and so God isn't dependent upon man to conceptualize what He is and to decide how to worship Him. Instead, it works the other way around. God tells man who man is, and God tells man how to worship Him. And so this is a completely different mindset about what a God is, and about the powers of a divine being, and about the way the relationship exists. This is certainly something new to them. And everything was made by this one God. There's not a God for everything. And so there's a very great shift. Secondarily, he's doing something else that's extremely important here. He's explaining to a huge assembly of Greek thinkers why they should care what a Jewish man has to say. Because he's not expressing his view about God, because God isn't served by human hands as though God needed anything, but God gives to man life and breath and everything that it is. So I'm not expressing to you my views about what you need to do for a God. I'm telling you what God Himself has done and what God Himself has said. In other words, he is speaking for God. He is not speaking for himself. The Epicurean philosophers, the Stoic philosophers, those who came from the school of Aristotle or Plato or any of the other philosophies that existed, they all started with a man. A man sat down and devised a philosophical system to explain the world and to explain how man can get, and he says it doesn't work that way. God isn't served by man as though God needs something. God tells us who He is and what He's done. How did a Greek god get somewhere? And they were carried. In fact, all idolatrous gods were carried. He said, God animates man. Man doesn't animate God. God has given to all life and breath and everything. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him, and yet He's actually not far from each one of us. I don't have time to talk about all that tonight, but I want to introduce what we'll be talking about, not next week because I'll be gone, but after the first of the year, when I get back and we pick up this class again, we'll be talking about those things. He begins to introduce to them the God of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what he's beginning to tell them. Any questions or comments before we stop? Thanks for those that have been watching online. Hey, Todd, it's good to see you. Miss Shirley, Miss Sheila, all you guys. And